So you've just created your first model and they're sat there ready to be painted. We need to first of all prepare our models for the stage where the real magic happens, and that is the painting. And that starts with two essential steps, your priming and base coating. These are the foundations of every miniature you'll ever paint, and understanding why we do them will make your painting smoother, cleaner and far more enjoyable. But before we even get to putting any paint onto these models, there is one key ingredient that we need: brushes. So for now, let's just move this stuff away. Before we get into base coating and layering, shading and dry brushing and all the fun stuff that brings your Warhammer models to life, we need to talk about one of the most important tools in the hobby, your brushes. And the good news is, you don't need a massive collection to get started. A small, reliable set of brushes will carry you through 90% of your painting. So for me, there are 4 core brushes that form the backbone of your painting toolkit. These will cover your priming, your base coating, detail work and quick highlights. When you're priming by hand, especially with brush-on primers, you'll want a large brush, something with a wide belly that can move paint quickly and evenly across the model. This isn't for detail work, it's your workhorse. The goal will be for smooth coverage without streaks, and a larger brush helps you avoid overworking the surface. This is what is usually called a size 2 brush, or sometimes it might be a monster brush or a regiment brush, depending on who the manufacturer is. You can of course get some bigger brushes, good for acrylic paints, if you are painting larger vehicles. Your next brush is a medium brush, the one you'll actually use the most. This is perfect for layering down your base colours. It holds enough paint to cover armour panels, cloth, skin and weapons without drying out too fast. A good medium brush gives you control, coverage and speed all at once. These are often a size 0. Small brushes are for detail work. Eyes, purity seals, rivets, edge highlights, tiny armour trims. This is where precision matters. A sharp point and good bristle spring make all the difference. You don't need an ultra tiny brush, just one that keeps a clean tip. This is a size 20 brush. Now, what you'll find with these brushes is, even though this size 2 is a big brush, it has the same fine tip as the size 0, 2 sizes down. So just because the paintbrush is small doesn't necessarily mean it will have a finer tip. Whatever paintbrush manufacturers you go for as your first paint set, your local gaming store will no doubt have sets available to you that covers off those 4 core brushes. So don't go out and buy dozens and dozens of brushes, and certainly don't go out and buy brushes that aren't really designed for painting miniatures, as you'll only disappoint yourself. The only other brush I would recommend getting when you first start are what are called dry brushes. Now dry brushes are a little bit like its name says. You put the paint on and then you brush off as much of it as you can so that the paint is dry, but it still would reflect when you push it onto the model. So dry brushing is one of the fastest ways to add instant highlights and textures to your models. A medium size gives you versatility, big enough for armour plates and bases, but still controlled enough for smaller areas. It's perfect for beginners because it creates quick, dramatic results with very little technique. So really, with just 4 brushes, that's a large brush, a medium base coat brush, a small detail brush and a medium dry brush, you can create entire armies and paint them to a great standard. You don't need 20 brushes. You don't need every specialist shape, size, variant. Start simple, learn how each brush behaves and build your skills from there. Your first set may well be synthetic brushes, which means the fine hairs that are on them are made out of synthetic materials. That is fine for your first starter set. They are often cheaper, easier to use and a bit more forgiving. Once you get comfortable, you'll then move to much finer sable hair brushes. These don't last as long, They do require a bit of care and attention when cleaning, which we'll cover off in future tutorials, but they do offer better control, they handle the paint a little bit better, and they allow for slightly smoother finishes. Priming is the first layer that goes onto your model, and it's absolutely vital. Raw plastic or resin doesn't hold paint very well. It's smooth, it's slightly oily, and paint tends to bead off or rub off. A primer gives the surface teeth, that little micro texture that helps the paint grip properly. It also creates a uniform colour base, so your paints have consistency across the model. Without primer, you'll find uneven coverage, patchy finishes, and pure durability, especially if you're using them as tabletop miniatures, as when you pick them up, the paint will just rub off on your thumbs and fingers. So priming does more than just help the paint stick, it sets the tone for your entire project. So you get improved adhesion, better coverage, surface protection, and clarity. And depending on your choice, black, white or grey, it can influence the mood and brightness of your final paint job. For instance, if you were wanting a bright finish, you could prime in white or a very light grey. If you were priming and looking to go for a medium tone, you could go for a mid-tone grey. Though bear in mind, the plastic is already a mid-grey, so when you prime in this colour, it is sometimes hard to see where you've painted. If sometimes you're going for a more darker, grim looking model, which is what I do, I prime in black. Of course, if you are painting an entire army of Dark Angels, you could decide to prime in green. There are as many colours of primers as there are colours available as base coating and highlight colours, so the world is your oyster. Now, for your very first model, it might not be necessary to actually prime it if you're just getting used to it, but certainly it is recommended moving forward to prime your models. There are differing ways to prime your models. You can prime them with a brush by using a brush on primer. You can prime them with the aerosol cans, which are available from most manufacturers, or you can prime with an airbrush. Sometimes when I prime with a brush, or I prime with an airbrush. I don't use the aerosol cans as I have a slight allergy to one of the ingredients that's widely used. If you are using an aerosol can, I would thoroughly recommend doing them outdoors or in an extremely well ventilated room, as they are toxic. There are other tutorials available on other websites about how to use aerosol cans. If you're using an airbrush, then I can cover off priming and using an airbrush in other tutorials. But as I said, priming is important, but maybe for this first tutorial you don't necessarily need to prime your miniature, but if you want to, you can just lay down a layer of your main coat of paint. So for instance, if you're painting ultramarine and you've got some ultramarine blue, then just give it a first layer of that and pretend that you're priming. When priming, you will need to thin your paints down, which we'll cover off later. The air primers you can brush on and you don't need to thin them down, but you do need to be careful with the adhesion. Some air primers don't work quite well via a brush. So although this tutorial wants to get you really started on the best ways of priming for your first miniature, it isn't necessarily something you need to do, and priming will be based off of how you want to prime your models. If you're doing it via brush, then you can just get some Baden black or any black colour or mid-tone grey colour and just apply a layer of that over your miniature, and once you're more confident, you can speak to your local gaming store about using the aerosol cans, as it does allow you to prime models much quicker, but obviously you have to do it really outdoors. It can be weather dependent. If you've got an airbrush or thinking of using an airbrush, you can prime miniatures extremely quickly by using the air primers. So now you want to prime your little gribbly man. What I would suggest having first is a little cup of cold tap water and a little plastic palette pot. You can buy palette sheets. you can of course buy wet pallets, but if this is your first few models, you obviously not want to be spending a lot of money in case you don't get on with the hobby, and it can be quite expensive when you first start out. So the idea is to buy items that you do desperately need when you are painting, that can survive quite a long time but allow you to move forward with the hobby. So yeah, a must-have is a cup of water, as we do use acrylic paints. Of course, acrylic paints will clean in water and thin with water. And a little plastic palette pot, which you can buy 5 of these for about £1 off of Amazon, because they allow the paint, you can put the paint into these little pots, thin them down a little bit of water, and they do stay wet for quite a bit of time. If we were to use them on the plates, they can, like a china plate, it can dry out a little bit quicker. The palette sheets that you can also get do tend to dry out a little bit too quick. The ideal goal, if you enjoy the hobby, would be to get yourself a wet palette, which we can cover off later on. But for now, a little pot like this and a little cup of water. The reason for the water is for thinning the paints. We don't use the paint straight out of the pot, it's too thick. Although these acrylic paints are designed to go straight onto the models, they do need thinning, otherwise it's too thick, it clogs up the detail. The pigments can be too big, when you've got a brush full of paint, the detail on these miniatures is so fine. Even though it looks small to the eye, when you put paint on it, if the paint is too thick, then it will just cover all that detail and you've ruined your model. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to prime my model in some normal acrylic paint, not specialist primer. For this I'm using the War Paints Fanatic Matte Black from the Army Painter series. So all acrylic paints, you have to give a really good shake. Some paints come with little ball bearings that you can hear now. If you can hear the ball bearing, generally means the paint is well mixed. If you can't hear the ball bearing, then the paint hasn't been mixed well, it's pulled on the bottom. Now some paints don't come like this, they're not in dropper bottles. Some paints come in tubs like the Warhammer paints. If they do, then just give it a good shake like you normally would. Take a paint pot brush out and put it into your little pot. We then need to thin the paint. So to do that, you can just grab a little bit of water onto your brush and just mix it in. And then, as this is your first time priming, now I've got a mega old brush. Look at that bad boy. Now, I've had this for, it must be 15 years. This is an old Citadel medium shade brush. It's lasted donkey's years. It's not very good for shading anymore, but it is good for putting on base coats and primers. If this is your first model, then you would have a nice new clean priming brush. And all you do is a little bit of paint on the brush, and because we're priming, you just apply the paint all over the model. We haven't got to be careful here, as long as we get a nice even coat, not too much paint on the brush at all. Try and get it into all those little nooks and crannies. The idea here is, even if it's very thin, as long as we get it all over the model, that's the goal, so that we don't have any bare plastic showing on our little Terminator there. And here we go. One model primed with a big old brush with some thinned down paint. It's got a nice layer of black over it that's finished smooth. Where we've added that water into the paint, where we've thinned it down, it allows for a nice smooth finish. Thinning your paints is an art unto itself and is quite complex, because there are as many manufacturers of paints as there are brushes. Each colour works a little bit differently, each manufacturer works a little bit differently. The idea of thinning the paints is that, one, it can last longer, but two, is we tend to apply multiple layers so that we get a nice, thin, smooth finish. As I've said, if the paint is too thick, it will clog up your detail and could dry patchy, blobby, and inconsistent. Thinning your paint allows us to sometimes be able to cover in one coat, but it gives a nice, smooth finish. In my tutorials, I go over how I thin my paints, but it does vary on the manufacturer and the colour and the stage at which you're at and how you want the colour to look. We'll go over thinning paints when we go over the different ways in these beginner series tutorials. But at first, knowing that you must add a little bit of water to each of your paints is essential. All paints will need thinning. It might just need one brush full of water. It might need two, dependent on how thick the paint is. So, once your primer's down and cured, fancy word for drying, the next step is your base coat, the first true layer of colour. And think of your base coats really as the foundation of your scheme. It defines the overall tone and helps every subsequent layer behave predictably. So what you're doing with base coating is you're establishing a consistent colour that blocks out the primer and gives your highlights and shadows something to build from. A good base coat will be smooth and even, not thick or chalky, and it's that bridge between the raw model and the artistry that follows with all of your lovely finishing touches. So base coating really now depends on what you're painting. If you're painting an ultramarine, you would base coat the armour in a nice mid-tone of blue. If it's a Blood Angel, a red. If you're painting something from Age of Sigmar, you could be doing a Stormcast Eternal, so you could be painting it in gold. Base coating is not just necessarily putting one even coat of one colour across the entire model. That was what your primer did. Your base coating will lay down either your darkest colour or the mid-tone colour of whatever it is you're painting. So what do we mean by the darkest colour? So that could be, if you were painting leather, you could put down your darkest leathery colour. Then your next colour would be slightly brighter and slightly brighter and brighter. When we'd use, say, a mid-tone colour, that's the colour in between the three. So you've got your darkest, your mid-tone, and your highlight is your third. So your mid-tone would be a mid-tone blue, which means you can shade it down darker and then use a highlight to make it brighter. Generally, as painters, that's what we'll do. We'll lay down our mid-tone, darken it down, and then you can bring it back up with a highlight. It totally depends on the outcome you're going for. For me, I'm going to start off by laying just down a simple mid-tone blue. Now, I'm using a colour called Imperial Navy from the Warpaints Fanatic series. These Fanatic series are quite good because what they'll allow you to do is you can buy them in a set. So you can buy a blue set, a green set, a red set, and they'll give you colours that start from a dark colour all the way through to a light colour. And they're a good place to go to if you're unsure of what colours to use. You can just buy one set and you'll get a dark colour all the way through to a light colour. Your local gaming store will have all the colours that you need. They'll have different manufacturers of paints. Some will recommend AK paints, some will recommend Warhammer paints, especially if you're in a Warhammer store. Depends the tutorials that you might be following. If you're going to be always following the Warhammer tutorials, then they will use Warhammer paints. Those are the ones you'll go for. If you're using my tutorials, I use paints from across multiple ranges. From the Army Painter series, to the AK range, to the Vallejo range. I use Warhammer paints, the Green Stuff World. There are dozens out there, and I will not recommend any particular one. It just depends on the outcome that you're going for and the colour that you want and the brand that you're most comfortable to use. So, we give the paint pot a good old shake. As I said, these ones have the little ball bearings. Put some paint into the pot. Brush full of water. Give it a bit of a stir. most of that paint off. Clean your brush out now, because obviously we've just packed it full of paint. Dry it off on a little paper towel. So, one thing to remember is we don't want to put a lot of paint on our brush. Too much paint, you can lose control. And then we just smoothly apply the paint onto the panels where we want the paint to be. Simple as that. Now you could be following box art. You could be just deciding you want to paint something bright pink because you like bright pink. Really, it totally depends. There's a lot of images out there, a lot of tutorials out there. But the idea here with the base coats is just to get that first layer down of your main colour that you can then work from. So that we know now that we can darken this down if we want to, we can brighten this up if we want to. This paint is really good. It's almost covering this in one layer. We will need two. That's okay. I'd rather have two thin layers than one thick layer and cover up the detail. Now this is your first model. Don't worry if you get paint on stuff you don't want to be the colour. It is not the end of the world. Worst case scenario, you just go back over it with your primer colour. Obviously, the more layers you start putting down, if we've just done blue and we've done some brown for the leather, gold or silver, you start to paint over already painted areas, then it is a little bit of a problem. You have to have a little bit of care. But for now, we don't have to be too clever. You could, really, if you wanted to, use your big primer brush and paint the whole thing with that in blue. Once you get started, if you're doing ultramarines or dark angels or blood angels or stormcast eternals, anything that's got a big uniform colour for the armour, you can generally apply as primers now. So you can prime the entire model from a spray can, from an airbrush, and then you've almost got your base coat there. But just work yourself around now. Just filling in all the bits that you want to be painted in the colour that you're using. Remembering that the paint is thinned. With a little drop of water. Not to put too much paint on the brush. Just to work yourself around. Making sure that it's nice and smooth. Once you're finished, then you just wash your brush out in the water, dry it off. Always remembering to wash your brushes out after every use for every colour. And there we go, we've got our base coated model. So I used a big brush for base coating because there's a lot of area to cover. It might be that you base coat smaller areas, so we've got the detail work in a smaller brush, so you might go down to a size 0 to paint in some finer details. But no matter what type of colour you're using, base coating is generally the same principles. You thin your paints, you apply it with a large or medium brush, even if it's a normal base coat colour like we've just done with the blue, or it's a base coat with a gold. Metallics work in exactly the same way. You still thin them down the same. Metallic paints can be a little bit thicker than other paints as they have the flex, metallic flex in them, but they still get thinned down and applied across. It's always good as well, even if you've primed your model in black but you want to paint an area black, to still apply a layer of black paint over it. So if you've primed it grey or red, just to go over it in your colour that you want to base coat in. Then once you've base coated your entire model, you've got something there that is ready to go on the tabletop. You've probably got your armor painted, weapon painted, some finer detail work in there has been base coated, and at that stage it is ready to go. You've got pretty much a fully painted model. You don't even have to worry about the base. You can just paint the base black or brown, and you'll go. You're good to go. You don't have to worry about doing a wash or doing any highlights. A base coated miniature is tabletop ready, and you can go off and play games. You can play games with just your grey miniatures. Your opponents might not like it. It's always generally good. The general rule is 3 colours. If you've got 3 colours on a miniature, then I'll generally say it's painted. So yeah, let's not go down that road. It opens up a can of worms. But yeah, for your first painted miniature, just dropped it. For your first painted miniature, get base coats down, gives you a nice firm base to build from. Your base coating will allow you to go darker. It will allow you to go brighter, or you can stop and off you go. So just some closing thoughts. So before you dive into your painting, take your time with priming and base coating. These steps might not be the flashiest. The foundation of a house isn't the flashiest, right? The outcome of the house is the flashy part. And it's the same with painting. Your base coating and priming isn't the flashy bit, but it's where that magic starts. It's your foundations of your painting. And if you get good at priming and base coating, the other steps will just work a lot easier. They stop being that grey plastic now and start becoming that living, breathing part of your army. So I hope you've enjoyed this little base coating and priming tutorial. There is a lot to it, surprisingly, and it's all dependent on the type of model you're painting and the type of colour that you're trying to go for. But for your first model, you can just get some blue paint and just, as long as you thin it down, you've got your little cup of water, a little palette pot here, or a wet palette if you manage to get yourself a first wet palette, and if you thin it down, you've got the right size brush for the right outcome. So for priming and base coating, you can use a slightly bigger brush, and you just work yourself down as you get to the finer details, and then layer down a few base coats and you've already got yourself a really good looking miniature. Just remembering, it's best to always put down your mid-tone colour. So we've got those 3 colours. We've got your darker tone, your mid-tone and your highlight. Mid-tones are that one that sits in the middle that allows you to go darker or that allows you to go brighter. So a mid-tone blue can go to a dark blue to a light blue highlight. Same with reds, purples, all the colours work in that same way. If you start dark, then you can still build up to, or you can layer up to medium and layer up to a highlight. But sometimes you can't go darker than you've already gone. It's totally up to yourselves how you want to do it. As a beginner, I would start with your mid-tones, so you can go darker or lighter, and also your mid-tones allow you just to do your base coats and stop, and then move across. If you do make a mistake, don't worry about it. If you start to prime your base coat your gold, and you just go over a little bit of blue armour, just paint over your blue armour with a little bit of blue. That's, mistakes will happen, and it's fine. These are acrylic paints. That's not the end of the world. You can just paint back over a section that you've done. Worst case scenario, you can start from scratch where you apply it so very thin. These can take dozens of layers of paint when you apply it thinly. So if you do a mistake, you can just base coat back over the top of it and off you go. One model can be painted in dozens of different ways. Also, don't forget, this is your hobby. If you want to paint your ultramarines bright pink, go for it. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. You might get some funny looks from the people that you play against or other fellowists in the hobby, but don't let it stop you from doing it. Please don't let it stop you from doing it. Much of how you'll learn to paint will be derived from experimentation, giving something a go. So just do it, and don't worry about it. As long as it doesn't hurt anybody, this hobby is yours, and you can paint your miniatures however you feel. But I would say following the principles of the painting is the most important. And the first part of that is your priming and your base coating. So I've waffled on a bit. I hope you've enjoyed it. Next tutorial will be for washes, where we can start applying some contrast to our models so that we can show where something has gone from our mid-tones and it's gone darker, so that we get some contrast from our deepest, darkest recesses and shadowy areas up to our bright points. So yeah, hope you've enjoyed it. Check out all my other tutorials that are available. There'll be a lot more of these starting guides coming out. And yeah, keep on painting, painters.